Today we're going to be looking a little bit about how God has a plan for each one of us. He's continually working in us to take us from where we are to where He wants us to be. And there's a process through which each one of us must go through to fulfill those plans that He has for us. And today we're going to be looking at the story of Moses and Zipporah, the wife of Moses, and how it gives us just a glimpse of that process. And we see this story in Exodus chapter 2, but in Exodus chapter 1, we read about how the Israelites, they were being oppressed in Egypt. And last week we were talking about Joseph and Asenath as a couple, but Joseph was one of the sons of Jacob. And Joseph rose to power in Egypt through a process, an unexpected process that he went through, or plan that he went through. And because of his position, it caused Jacob and Joseph's brothers to come to Egypt to find basically salvation, to be saved because of a severe famine that had gone on in the land. And so Jacob moving to Egypt with Joseph and his other brothers, well, Jacob became known as Israel. His name was changed. And so we have the Israelites that were in Egypt at that time. And now a new king came into power, and he began using the Israelites for forced labor. And he was cruel to them. He oppressed them. And the more that he oppressed the people of Israel, the more they multiplied in number. And he was fearful of the fact that they were such a large number of people. And so the king commanded that the midwives who were present during the birth of these Hebrew children, that if a male was born, that they would kill that male on the spot. And it's at this time in Exodus, beginning of Exodus chapter 2, where Moses was born. And so he was one of those children that should have been killed at the moment of birth, but God had protected him. And in fact, Moses' mother hid him for 3 months from the authorities, from the people of Egypt. And after that 3 months, she couldn't hide him anymore. She decided to put him in a basket and place him in the Nile River. And in a short time, Pharaoh's daughter, the Pharaoh of Egypt, found this basket with Moses, and she took this little boy in as her own child, and she raised him in her home. And then we get to Exodus chapter 2, verse 11, and it tells us that Moses grew up, and he was watching his own people. Even though he was an Egyptian by the way he lived, he was a Hebrew. And he was watching his own people, the Hebrews, and the hard work that they were doing for the Egyptians. And at one point he saw an Egyptian who was being very cruel to a Hebrew, beating him. And so Moses comes to the defense of this Hebrew, and he kills the Egyptian, and he buries him in the sand. The next day, he's out and about, and he sees two Hebrews that were fighting against each other, and so he goes to them to see what was wrong. And those Hebrews, they turned to him and said, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to do the same thing to us that you did to that Egyptian? Are you going to kill us like you did to him? And it scared him, or he realized that somehow his deed was made known to those around him. And then Pharaoh heard about the killing of the Egyptian, and so he tried to have Moses killed. And because of that, Moses fled Egypt, and he went to the land called Midian. And it's here in Midian that Moses comes to the defense of 7 daughters, the 7 daughters of Reuel, a priest in Midian. In return for his care for his daughters, Reuel, however you say his name, gave Zipporah to Moses to be his wife. Well, eventually, as we go on in Exodus 3, eventually the king that wanted Moses dead, died. and a new king came into power, and God was hearing the cries of the Israelites, of the oppression that they were still facing. So he went to Moses to send him back to Egypt to rescue the Israelites. And that's the story of the burning bush, where Moses sees this bush as if it's on fire, and so he goes to the bush, and God calls out to him to tell him to go back to Egypt to rescue his people. And Moses does. He does return, and in the rest of Exodus, we read out Moses returns back to Egypt, and he goes to Pharaoh to proclaim God's message of "Let my people go." And in time, after many attempts and several plagues, Pharaoh finally relents and lets Moses lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. And from leaving Egypt to arriving in the Promised Land, the Israelites spend 40 years in the wilderness to reach their destination. Well, a few things that we can learn from this passage. Number one is this: our past does not disqualify us from God's service. Think about what Moses did, what Moses went through. In his attempt to defend his own people, Moses became a murderer. And even though he did not think anyone knew of this act, the truth came out. And since the truth came out, he became a hunted man, to where he had to flee the land in which he grew up to a land he would be a foreigner of. And can you imagine the mindset of Moses at this time? Here he was, a known murderer, fleeing for his life, no longer part of the ruling class of Egypt, but now a fugitive on the run. His position, though, did not disqualify him from being used in a mighty way for God. And the same is true for us. Many times we go through life in our past, we think, the things I did in my past, there's no way God will use me. But that's not true. Our past does not disqualify us from service to God. What are some of those areas in our lives where we have failed God? We know we have failed God. We have turned away from Him. We've done things that we shouldn't have done. And we feel that we are incapable of being used by Him in any way. We need to take to heart, God will use whomever He chooses. He uses whomever He chooses, no matter the baggage that we bring with us because of our past. The time would come when God would reach out to Moses again and to use him to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. The events of his past did not stop God from using him to complete his work. Number two, our path does not separate us from God's providence. Again, you look at Moses' path in life. It was definitely unique. He was born as a Hebrew, hidden from the Egyptians, but found by the Egyptians, raised as an Egyptian, and he lived in Pharaoh's household, the leader of Egypt. He lived in that household, and yet he stood up for the Hebrews, for those people, his own people. He chose to get involved in the things that were happening in Egypt at that time. He chooses to get involved through the killing of an Egyptian, and because of that had to flee the area to avoid the consequences of his actions. Even though the path was not what he should have taken, it did not separate him from God's providence. God knew what he was going to do with Moses from the moment he was born, before he was even thought of. God knew what he was going to do with Moses. And God still sought him out to do the work that God had planned for him to do. He may have appeared to be out of God's will simply by the life that he had lived and the things that he had done wrong, but God used Moses' choices for his own purposes. Consider the path that we're on in our life. None of us have taken a perfect path in life. We've all strayed one way or another. We've all done things that we shouldn't have done. There are many who have wandered far from God and making bad choices along the way, but God still uses us for his purposes. For all things are under his control, that providence that is God. We might think we mess up, but God will use that for his benefit. We may really stray off course, but God will use that for his glory. And so just understanding that the path we take does not separate us from God's providence. He's going to use whomever he chooses. Number 3, our potential is known and part of God's plan. God knew Moses' potential to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, even if Moses didn't believe it. God reached out to Moses. He had heard the cries of the people of Israel. And so God, through a burning bush, goes to Moses and calls him to lead the people out of Egypt and into the promised land. And Moses' response is, "Are you sure it's me that you want to send? My speaking isn't very good. Are you sure I'm the one that you want to send?" But God knew the potential that Moses had. And it was part of God's plan to use him to bring the people out of Israel, out of Egypt, and to glorify his name. Throughout the book of Exodus, we see how God uses Moses to break free from the Egyptian bondage. And God's plan was to use Moses to show the power of God and his love for the Israelites. In the same way, he has a plan for each one of us. He is calling us to follow him and to live for him and to fulfill the work that is before us. A question we should ask ourselves, are we willing to allow God to use us in areas that are beyond our comfort zone? Moses, that was beyond his comfort zone. He didn't feel like, or he didn't think he was a man that had the ability to speak in such a way that would influence the people. And yet God used him. It was out of his comfort zone. Are we willing to allow God to use us in those places that are outside of our comfort zone for his glory? And then number 4, God's plans will often lead to times in the wilderness. From this point on in Exodus, Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt. They go through the Red Sea and they're in the wilderness. And they're on their way to the promised land. Now this journey that should have only taken a few days or a couple weeks, however long it would have taken, it took them 40 years. 40 years in the wilderness. And the reason for that was because they needed that time in the wilderness to be ready to enter into the promised land. There was sin in the camp. There was distrust in the camp. There was lack of affection for the Lord, a love for the Lord. And so instead of just a few days or a couple weeks, 40 years for them to be prepared to enter into the promised land. Once the sin was dealt with, then the people would be ready to enter into the land. And that's a similar case for each one of us as we walk with the Lord. He has a plan for us and is leading us to his best, that presence with him. But there will be times of wilderness wanderings, those times where we wonder if God is even around. Those times where we feel like we're not accomplishing much of anything, but it's during this time, those times that God is working in us and through us to strengthen us and our faith in him. We're not to despair during those times of wandering, and I know everybody goes through those times of wandering, the wilderness. We're not to despair during those times, but we are to be looking to God for his guidance. Because in the end, we will come through our time in the wilderness into the blessed presence of our Lord. So I just want you to remember this. God has a plan for you. He has a plan. He's working that plan in you right now. You may be going through the wilderness, but that's part of it. He has a plan. Do you trust Him to lead you through whatever life brings, to be used by Him and to fulfill the work that He gives to you? He's got a plan. Are you trusting Him? God bless you. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.